Welcome to my retrospective on 2025. This year, there was so much chaos, so much tragedy and suffering, so much conflict and uncertainty, so much change and volatility that it was difficult to decide just where to begin this coverage. After much deliberation, I'll begin by turning my attention to what was once one of the most revered countries in the world, the United States of America. At the end of 2024, Americans shocked the world when they elected Donald Trump for a second term. Trump represented something truly dark. He ran on a platform of division, hatred, and oppression. He represented the opposite of everything that America was supposed to represent. But people voted for him anyway. Following that fateful election date in November, it was inevitable that America would begin to falter and sputter. But what was truly shocking was the horrific rapidity with which the United States descended towards outright fascism and authoritarianism. America's government is supposed to have checks and balances in place to prevent rule by decree, but at every step of the way they failed. Politicians, both Republican and Democrat, business leaders, the courts, the universities, the media, even law firms all failed in their duty to stand up to the power-hungry, deranged narcissist in the White House. Though even as everything seemed hopeless, the American people showed resilience. They took to the streets in protest against the madness coming from their leaders. Today, America sits on a precipice. Will she fall into total authoritarianism, or can she be pulled back from the brink? Trump took office in January, and by June the streets of some American cities were already beginning to resemble something from historical East Germany. In June, Trump fabricated a crime wave in Los Angeles, and then used that lie as a pretext to send National Guard troops into the city. This was in direct opposition to the desire of the California governor. For weeks, protesters took to the streets in opposition to the military-style deployment, and despite tense standoffs, no widespread violence was reported, despite what Donald Trump claimed. Using Los Angeles as a template, Trump began sending National Guard troops into other Democratic cities, including Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Portland. In all cases, Trump has claimed, without evidence, that the troops were needed to stop rampant crime in the cities, despite verifiable statistics showing the exact opposite. Trump has also strictly targeted Democratic cities while leaving Republican-controlled cities, many of which have actually been experiencing an increase in crime, alone. Wherever they've been deployed, Trump's troops have been met with opposition and protests, which have largely been peaceful, though in Washington, D.C., 2 National Guard troops were shot by an Afghan refugee. That shooting led Trump to begin unfairly targeting Somali refugees across the United States. One of his core election promises was to crack down on immigration, and Trump has certainly done that by launching an attack on visible minorities. It started in May when militarized immigration cops detained and deported Mahmoud Khalil, a lawful green card holder and permanent resident of the United States. By all accounts, Khalil was targeted because of his pro-Palestinian activism and political views, and it marked the first time in modern history that the United States had begun targeting people for exercising their right to free speech. Despite court challenges, Trump quickly escalated his attacks on minorities, in March extraditing dozens of Venezuelans to a notorious detention center in El Salvador. One of the deportees, Alberto Garcia, had legal status to live and work in the United States, but was deported anyway. While in El Salvador, he was subjected to inhumane conditions. It took numerous court challenges and several months to bring Garcia back to the United States. Trump's deliberate campaign of fear and intimidation was supercharged in July when Congress passed a funding bill which gave ICE, the U.S. Immigration Police, billions of dollars in new funding at the expense of the health insurance of millions of American citizens. Under the new funding regime, Trump turned ICE into his private Gestapo, hiring hundreds of new officers with little or no vetting and giving them expanded powers to detain and interrogate anyone without probable cause. Trump's Gestapo has been given deportation quotas and has built massive deportation camps, some of them modeled after Nazi concentration camps, to house detainees before sending them to seemingly random third world countries of their choosing. ICE, which has predominantly been targeting Democratic-led cities, has been heavily criticized for using military-style tactics against civilians, and their detention camps have been described as inhumane at best. While all of this has been going on, the American public hasn't been silent. There have been regular clashes between the citizens and the ICE Gestapo, and many businesses have refused to serve the troops or even let them use the bathroom. Citizen-led groups in several cities have also put together early warning systems to notify immigrant communities about troop movements, giving them time to retreat to a safe place. The fact, though, that any of this is taking place in America, the so-called land of the free, is shocking. Trump has also begun targeting trusted American institutions, including universities, law firms, and the media. Beginning in July, Trump began canceling and withholding federal grants to Ivy League schools, including Columbia, Brown, Harvard, and Cornell. Trump wanted influence on school curriculum, along with the ability to provide his ICE Gestapo with access to enrollment records to further their deportation agenda. Trump's regime has also severely curtailed the number of international students admitted to the United States, which further damages the bottom lines of many of these institutions. While Trump has yet to exert direct control over staffing and curriculum, many universities have folded and signed deals with the regime, which include payments to the federal government and new restrictions on protests and freedom of expression on campus. Even the most public holdout, Harvard University, who has been actively fighting the Trump regime in the courts, is reportedly on the cusp of signing their own capitulation agreement. Even universities seem to be unwilling to stand up to the power that Trump so readily abuses. One would think that the American media, particularly the so-called liberal media, would stand up to Donald Trump, but that simply hasn't been the case, with cable news channels and broadcast networks essentially normalizing what amounts to a fascist takeover of the world's most recognized democracy. In the few cases where broadcasters have tried to contradict the lies and misinformation spewed by Trump and his allies, the regime has abused the courts to try and silence them, such as with the multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against ABC and CBS. In both cases, the broadcasters' corporate masters opted to settle and pay the Trump administration millions of dollars for fear of angering the president. Trump's antagonism of the media hasn't stopped at home either. In December, he announced a $10 billion lawsuit against Britain's BBC over a program that wasn't even aired in the United States. Some of the few fearless critics of Trump have been the late-night comedy talk show hosts who have called out his bullshit night after night. However, even comedians haven't been immune from persecution at the hands of Trump. In July, CBS announced that it would be canceling The Late Show entirely, leaving prominent Trump critic Stephen Colbert and his entire staff without jobs. While in September, ABC suspended Jimmy Kimmel Live and only brought the show back after public outrage. Billionaires are Trump's best friends, and in the weeks following the election results, it was disgusting to see them line up to kiss the ring and become BFFs with the president. This, of course, followed the hostile takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk in 2024, another billionaire Trump supporter. In December, the popular app TikTok agreed to sell its U.S. assets to a consortium of American companies, one of which is Oracle, owned by Larry Ellison, a prominent Trump supporter. In January, Mark Zuckerberg announced that all fact-checking would be suspended on Meta's various social media platforms in a clear nod to the president. In July, it was announced that Skydance Studios, owned by the son of the aforementioned Trump-promoting Larry Ellison, would be acquiring Paramount Global, and critically the broadcaster CBS. It wasn't long before Trump's influence would make it onto the CBS airwaves. The network raised eyebrows in December when it abruptly killed a story just hours before it was scheduled to be broadcast. The story was supposed to be about the inhumane conditions at Trump's deportation camps. Internal CBS emails suggest that the move to kill the story was politically motivated. Not satisfied with the acquisition of the broadcast network, Paramount would then go on to launch a hostile takeover bid of Warner Bros. Discovery, which owns cable news outlet CNN. The ongoing consolidation of ownership of both legacy and social media to billionaires in bed with Trump is a page straight out of the Russian oligarchy. It's a clear threat to the independence of journalism in the United States. Gerrymandering is the process of redrawing state electoral maps to favor one political party over the other. And Trump, who wants to ensure Republicans stay in control of Congress, has been pressuring states to do just that. It all started in August when Texas redrew their maps to give Republican candidates a leg up in 5 districts. Several other Republican-led states followed suit, with Ohio, North Carolina, Missouri, Utah, and Florida all attempting to redraw maps to favor the Republican Party. Notably, California has responded by redrawing their own electoral maps to favor several new Democratic candidates, and Indiana has so far resisted pressure from Trump and his cronies to gerrymander their state districts. Trump has weaponized the Justice Department, using it as a tool to persecute some of his political opponents. So far, Trump has ordered the DOJ to launch investigations into the former FBI Director James Comey, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and New York District Attorney Letitia James, all of whom are critical of the president. Trump has also done his best to meddle with the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. The Federal Reserve is supposed to remain independent, but Trump wants the Fed to lower interest rates in order to score short-term political points to help the Republicans win in the 2026 midterm elections. He has begun publicly hurling insults at Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and he caused further outrage when he attempted to fire Lisa Cook, one of the Federal Reserve governors, something that he simply doesn't have the power to do. A cornerstone of Trump's economic agenda is to raise money by imposing tariffs on products imported to the United States. Trump is great at making up bullshit reasons for his tariffs, and he claims without evidence that his tariffs will magically restore the glory days of manufacturing in America. The fact, though, is that Trump's tariffs create economic chaos and are ultimately paid by the consumer of the products, in this case, the American people. Trump's tariffs have been so ill-considered that his announcement of them sent American stock markets into a tailspin, until, of course, he announced a pause, which caused markets to skyrocket in the other direction. I suspect some of his billionaire buddies made a lot of money when that happened. Following his inauguration in January, Trump enraged many by appointing billionaire ally Elon Musk the head of a newly invented special branch, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. As head of the agency, Musk, who was never elected by anyone, began wildly swinging an axe across government departments, cutting funding to nearly everything. The result of Musk's ill-considered cuts was chaos. Foreign aid programs were canceled, food and water inspections sidelined, and the FAA employees responsible for ensuring the safety of air travel were terminated. In many cases, following Musk's sledgehammer approach, laid-off employees were actually rehired as the targeted departments failed to run without them. Musk, who, remember, is unelected, was also handed access to copious amounts of sensitive data from each department he was supposedly making more efficient, data which he can then turn around and use to enrich himself and his own companies. By all accounts, Musk is some $170 billion richer after his partnership with Trump materialized. Prior to Donald Trump's second term, the Oval Office was often seen as a symbol of American diplomacy. It has hosted countless foreign dignitaries and heads of state. But under Donald Trump, the Oval Office is more representative of a cheap theater, a place where Trump and his cronies delight in making guests uncomfortable. This became abundantly clear on February 28th when Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The meeting was supposed to be about a proposed mineral deal between the US and Ukraine, but quickly slid into a shouting match after Trump and his vice president began berating Zelensky, calling him ungrateful and all kinds of other names. The scene was like something out of a movie, and it was an embarrassment to decades of American diplomacy. Zelensky, not the only victim of Trump's bullying. When South African President Cyril Ramaphosa met with Trump, he too was berated, called names, and slapped with fabricated accusations that his government was complicit in the murder of white farmers. Under Trump, public health has taken a sharp downward trend, with incompetent leadership, funding cuts, and high-profile resignations leading to America's worst measles outbreak in decades. It all started on February 13th when the Republican-controlled Senate voted to confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary. Kennedy is a well-known anti-vaxxer and conspiracy theorist, and has wasted no time imposing his beliefs on the agency. By June, he had replaced the entire advisory committee on immunization with hand-picked yes-men, and by November he forced the CDC to rewrite literature implying that vaccines could contribute to autism. Under Kennedy, there have been dozens of high-profile departures from the CDC and other public health agencies, leaving the organizations mere shells of their former prominence. Kennedy's leadership has led to the largest measles outbreak in America in decades, and the country is on the verge of losing its measles elimination status. And sadly, misinformation created in America doesn't stay in America, and Kennedy's vitriol has bolstered anti-vax sentiment around the world, particularly here in Canada, where we also saw the worst measles outbreak in decades. In November, the World Health Organization determined that Canada had lost its measles elimination status altogether. While Trump is inflicting most of his damage on Americans, he has also created unprecedented tensions with some of America's closest allies and has contributed to global instability. Trump has repeatedly uttered threats against both Canada and Greenland, threatening to annex them into the United States, including by military force if necessary. In Canada, Trump's threats have sparked unprecedented anti-American sentiment and has sent cross-border tourism into a tailspin, with Canadian visits to the US down by more than 30%. Trump has also been trying to destabilize Venezuela, likely in an attempt to force regime change. It all started in September after the US military began launching airstrikes on boats in the Caribbean. The US claimed the boats were used by drug smuggling gangs, something that they have failed to provide evidence to support. The boat strikes themselves are largely considered to be illegal, and may actually amount to a war crime, particularly in light of the fact that the US has been pursuing a double tap policy, in which they launch a second strike on an already disabled vessel. Trump escalated things when he refused to rule out a ground invasion of Venezuela and authorized the CIA to perform covert operations in the country. And most recently, the US has been engaging in acts of piracy by commandeering Venezuelan oil tankers and taking the oil for their own use, claiming that the oil was drug oil and their collection of it was reparations. All of this is occurring against the backdrop of Trump pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, a convicted drug lord. If he actually cared about drug smuggling, then why pardon one of the most prolific smugglers? Trump has also been meddling in the affairs of other Latin American countries, notably trying to skew election results in Honduras by threatening to cut off aid to the country if the left-leaning presidential candidate was elected. Honduras is still counting votes in an election that was too close to call. Throughout all of this, Trump has faced opposition from the courts, particularly state courts, which have issued numerous injunctions against his shocking acts. In June, the U.S. Supreme Court, which was stacked by Trump appointees during his first term, limited the powers wielded by the lower courts as they pertain to federal proclamations. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Trump's kryptonite, the Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein was, of course, a powerful sex trafficker and pedophile who repeatedly trafficked underage girls for some of the world's most powerful men. Epstein, who was a well-known associate of Donald Trump, was arrested and charged in 2019 and subsequently died under suspicious circumstances. Since then, there have been calls for the U.S. Justice Department to release the files they had pertaining to Epstein, and this pressure increased following Trump's re-election. In July, Trump's people released a statement that no such files existed and therefore couldn't be released. However, few believed them. As pressure mounted, including from within his own support base, Trump and the Republican Party continued to try to prevent release of the files, going as far as indefinitely delaying the swearing-in of a Democratic congresswoman in a bid to stop the House from getting enough signatures to force the release. Eventually, though, Trump and the Republicans were forced to release the files, and on December 19th, heavily redacted versions were released to the public. Criticism of the release, though, was swift, since most of the files are so heavily redacted they contain no useful information, and litigation is ongoing to obtain unredacted versions of the files. Of the information that is public are numerous pictures of Trump and Epstein together, along with Epstein posing with other prominent figures, such as Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, Steve Bannon, and the former Prince Andrew. None of the unredacted files that have been so far released show any wrongdoing. As a result of the Epstein scandal, Prince Andrew of the British royal family was stripped of his titles in October over his association with the late sex offender. He is now known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and will no longer be permitted to live on the royal estate. While all might seem to be hopeless, the American people themselves have proven to be resilient, coming out time and time again to protest Trump's shocking dismantling of the America they knew. One of the largest protests took place on October 18th, in which more than 5 million people took to the streets in every single state across the country. There is hope, then, that resistance to this regime could make a difference. Israel's war on Palestine, considered by many to now be a genocide, continued throughout 2025. January saw a brief cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip as Hamas militants released some hostages they had taken in October of 2023. Israel, though, refused to allow aid to enter Gaza, which quickly escalated the humanitarian crisis in the enclave. By March, the pause in fighting had completely fallen apart, and Israel resumed full military operations against Gaza. By August, Israel began a ground invasion and full annexation of the Gaza Strip, while still preventing aid from entering the territory. The United Nations and human rights groups accuse Israel of using starvation as a tactic of war, something that is most definitely a war crime. On August 22nd, the situation had become so bad that the United Nations declared the territory had begun to experience a famine, and by this time Israel was finally forced to act. Rather than allowing international aid agencies to cross into Gaza, Israel instead set up food distribution centers and staffed them with soldiers and military contractors. The so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation quickly became notorious for the killing of civilians queuing at the distribution centers for food, leading to calls for the foundation to be immediately dismantled. Some 1,000 civilians had been killed at GHF distribution sites before the agency was dismantled in October. Throughout the year, negotiations were ongoing between the US, Hamas, and Israel to try and negotiate a ceasefire. And in October, a breakthrough agreement was finalized that would see a cessation of Israeli hostilities, a return of all remaining hostages, living and dead, and a resumption of aid shipments into Gaza. The ceasefire took effect on October 9th and has mostly held, though Israel is accused of repeatedly violating it. While most of the active conflict has been inside Gaza, Israel has been making life miserable for Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank as well. Throughout the year, Israel has repeatedly launched raids into the West Bank, jailing citizens, attacking infrastructure, and even cutting off water supplies for farmers. In July, the Israeli parliament announced that it had plans to annex the entire West Bank, although it has yet to be enacted. In response to Israel's genocidal attacks on Palestine, many Western governments, including Australia, Canada, France, and the UK, have formally recognized Palestine as a state, meaning that just over 80% of the countries worldwide now accept a Palestinian state. But of course, nothing in our world happens in a vacuum, and Israel's increasing brutality has stoked anti-Semitic sentiment around the world. In May, 2 people were killed after a gunman in Washington, D.C. opened fire at an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum. In June, 1 person was killed and 13 injured after an attacker shouting "Free Palestine" used a makeshift flamethrower to attack a pro-Israel rally in Boulder, Colorado. In September, 2 gunmen killed 6 people inside Israel when they opened fire inside a bus, while in October, an attacker with a knife killed 3 people in Manchester when he attacked a synagogue. But by far, the worst attack of the year against Jews came at the beginning of the Hanukkah celebrations on Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. A father and son duo opened fire on attendees, killing 16 and injuring 40 others. Israel has also been particularly aggressive toward its neighbors. Israel and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah signed a ceasefire agreement near the end of 2024. However, throughout the year, Israeli forces have continued to engage in military campaigns targeting southern Lebanon. They've destroyed buildings and killed both civilians and militants. In June, Israel significantly escalated the existential crisis with Iran after they launched a military campaign against alleged Iranian nuclear sites. In response, Iran sent hundreds of drones and missiles hurling towards Israel, though the vast majority of them were intercepted by Israeli air defenses. The United States then entered the conflict, directly attacking the Iranian military infrastructure with B-2 bombers and Tomahawk missiles, and Iran's response was to then fire missiles towards a U.S. military base in Qatar. While the situation seemed to be rapidly spiraling out of control, a ceasefire between the 3 sides was quickly reached by June 24th. Israel also launched an unprovoked attack on the Syrian capital Damascus in July. Israel said the attack was in response to an ongoing internal conflict within Syria's Sudawaya province. The most shocking assault, though, took place on September 9th when Israel launched an airstrike on the Qatari capital Doha. Israel claims it was targeting senior Hamas leadership who had gathered in the capital for peace negotiations with Israel. The attack was a shock to the world, since Qatar is a major ally of the United States and houses the largest U.S. military base in the region. Israel has also been embroiled in an ongoing conflict with Yemen's Houthi rebels. The Houthis have expressed solidarity with Palestinians and have launched a series of missiles at Israel, including one which struck a regional airport. In response, Israel has launched a number of missile and airstrikes on various targets inside of Yemen, and the United States has also launched a number of airstrikes inside Yemen, a response, they say, to Houthi rebels targeting commercial ships in the Red Sea. Russia's war on Ukraine continued throughout 2025, with the front lines relatively unchanged from the previous year. Russia launching continuous indiscriminate attacks against Ukraine, with Ukraine doing their best to hold down the front line. In April, a Russian missile targeted civilian areas in the northeastern city of Sumy, killing 35 people, including 2 children. June saw a rare win for Ukraine after they successfully launched a drone attack deep within the borders of Russia. They destroyed part of Russia's air fleet in that attack. Throughout the year, there have been ongoing attempts to negotiate a ceasefire between the two parties, with Donald Trump flip-flopping multiple times between whether he supports Russia or Ukraine. After months of meetings, including a high-profile in-person meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, a ceasefire seems to be no closer to reality. Ukraine relies on support from Western governments, both financial and militarily. But following the election of Donald Trump, the support from the United States has largely dried up, leaving the burden of Ukraine's defense on the shoulders of the UK and Europe. In December, an attempt to use frozen Russian assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars to fund Ukraine's war effort failed, though the European Union has given a €90 billion loan to the embattled country. Russia has also been harassing Europe by sending drones and balloons to European airports, causing travel chaos. Sudan has been embroiled in a civil war since April of 2023, and the ongoing bloodbath has displaced more than 8 million people and sparked a widespread famine that affects as many as 25 million. In January, a particularly horrific attack took place at the Saudi hospital in El Fasher, where as many as 70 people were killed by militants. In March, the Sudanese army made some gains when they managed to retake control of the central bank in Khartoum, but in October the entire city of El Fasher fell into the hands of the militants, leading to a massacre of thousands. Conflict has erupted in the Democratic Republic of Congo between Congolese troops and the M23 rebel groups, who are backed by the Rwandan government. The rebels have been making gains in the western DRC, with rebels advancing on the cities of Goma and Bukavu. Donald Trump attempted to negotiate a peace treaty between the Rwandan and Congolese governments. However, despite a deal being signed in June, attacks by the rebels are ongoing. Conflict between India and Pakistan broke out in May after 26 civilians were killed in a terrorist attack in the Indian region of Kashmir. India accused the Pakistani government of supporting terrorism and launched missile strikes within Pakistan. This prompted a Pakistani response, and what followed was described as the largest beyond visual engagement between the two countries in history. At the peak of the conflict, 114 aircraft were involved, although no aircraft actually crossed the border. Tensions quickly de-escalated after a ceasefire was signed on May 10th. 2025 was a particularly active year for weather, with wildfires, storms, and flooding making headlines around the world. In January, a massive storm pummeled the UK, causing more than 1 million people to lose power and resulting in the deaths of 3. Los Angeles placed more than 130,000 people on evacuation order after the Pacific Palisades fire tore through suburbs of the city. The fire leveled more than 1,000 structures and left at least 5 dead. In March, South Korea faced some of its worst wildfires in recent memory after more than 300 fires burned through some 250,000 acres and killed 32 people. By May, wildfires were burning out of control in the Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. While the fires largely burned through uninhabited areas, they destroyed some 20 million acres and contributed to poor air quality thousands of kilometers away. In Nigeria, some 538 people were killed after heavy rainfall resulted in flooding across much of the southeast of the country. Also in May, the U.S. Midwest experienced an outbreak of tornadoes that killed 67 people and devastated dozens of communities. Summer arrived in Europe with a vengeance when heat waves swept the continent in June and July. Over the summer, it's thought that as many as 4,000 people have died as a result of the heat, prompting Spain to begin construction of extreme weather cooling centers across the country. In July, wildfires burned across Turkey, prompting the evacuation of some 50,000 residents. In July, more than 130 people were killed in central Texas after heavy rains caused widespread flooding along the Guadalupe River. Most horrifying was that 27 children were killed when the flooding inundated Camp Mystic, which was situated along the river. It has also been reported that Elon Musk's cuts to government departments delayed the release of weather warnings surrounding the imminent flooding. Also in July, Typhoon Danis made landfall in Taiwan, killing 10 and causing about $250 million in damages. Throughout August and September, floodwaters devastated parts of India and Pakistan, displacing some 1.5 million people, destroying crops, and killing hundreds. In August, Spain saw some of its worst wildfires in 2 decades after more than 1 million hectares of forests were burned and 30 people were killed. The Canadian province of Newfoundland was also struck by widespread wildfires in August, with thousands evacuated when the fire burned close to the provincial capital, St. John's. In September, large portions of Southeast Asia experienced landslide and floods as the result of heavy rainfall in the region. Some 2 million people have been displaced in the aftermath of the disaster, and it is thought that more than 5,000 have been killed. In October, Jamaica was devastated after Hurricane Melissa made landfall. The Category 5 storm was Jamaica's costliest disaster, causing some $10 billion in damages and killing 102 people. There were also a number of seismic events in 2025, with an earthquake in Tibet killing 126 people on January 7th, when a magnitude 7.1 quake struck Tangier County. The Tibetan quake was followed up by a 7.7 magnitude earthquake in Myanmar on March 28th, which left some 5,500 people dead. Some 79 people were killed in the Philippines when a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck in the center of the country. The quake caused an estimated $320 billion in damages. And there was little damage but major disruption after an earthquake in Russia's Kamacha region prompted a tsunami warning for much of the Pacific, including the North American west coast. Fortunately, though, no tsunami resulted from the quake. Germany held elections in February. Although the extreme-right AfD party was held off by a centrist coalition, this was by far the largest show of support for the AfD. It signals a disturbing swing to the far right not seen since the Second World War. In August, Bolivia elected its first right-wing government in more than 2 decades. Chile also saw the election of a right-wing government with the election of Jose Antonio Cast as president. The results in Chile and Bolivia signal a stark shift to the right in South America in general, a region that has been dominated by left-leaning political leaders for years. A surprise result in the Canadian elections after voters chose to elect Mark Carney and his centrist Liberal government. While the lead-up to 2025 saw the Conservative Party dominate in the polls, the election of Donald Trump and his continuous barrage of attacks against Canada pushed voters to support the left-of-centre Liberal Party. Following the election, Canada's 45th Parliament was opened by King Charles, a clear nod of support from the British monarch to Canada in her fight against the existential American threat. Tanzania held presidential elections in October, which saw the incumbent candidate receive more than 97% of the popular vote. The electoral process is largely viewed as undemocratic, and violent protests sprung up immediately following the announcements. It's estimated that as many as 2,000 people may have died as a result of the violence in Tanzania. Turkey's government has in recent years begun to take a more authoritarian stance, and this continued in 2025. In March, authorities arrested the popular mayor of Istanbul after he became a presidential candidate. Following the mayor's arrest, protests broke out across Istanbul and in other places in Turkey, although they have been largely quashed by police. Officials also detained and deported BBC journalist Mark Lowen in the aftermath of the demonstrations. Mass demonstrations in Serbia have been taking place since 2024 as a protest against government corruption and inaction in its response to a railway station collapse last year. As the government attempted to crack down on the demonstrations, the protests grew in size and scale, and the Serbian government has been widely criticized for the brutality used in their attempts to quell the demonstrations. Madagascar's government fell on October 12th when the president was overthrown by an elite military unit. The coup was the culmination of a protest movement which had begun a month earlier in demonstration against water and power shortages. Indonesia experienced civil unrest over the summer when protesters took to the streets in opposition to changes to housing subsidies. The demonstrations grew in size and scale after a police vehicle drove over a demonstrator, killing him. Demonstrations in Nepal led to the resignation of the country's president in September. Demonstrators took to the streets following a nationwide ban on social media platforms. In France, far-right leader Marine Le Pen was banned from politics after a court found her guilty of embezzling European Union funds. Le Pen is significant because she is the former leader of the extremist National Rally Party and led them to their strongest showing in parliamentary elections. Conflict broke out between Thailand and Cambodia after one soldier was killed in a skirmish in a long-standing disputed border region. Attempts to de-escalate the situation failed, and both sides began building up a military presence on the border. Since then, numerous clashes have erupted between the two sides, leaving at least 50 people dead, and thousands of civilians have been displaced. Donald Trump was quick to try and take credit for a ceasefire between the two countries in late July. However, the ceasefire failed, with clashes reigniting in November. Aviation took a major reputational hit in 2025, with a number of high-profile airline crashes occurring around the world. In January, 67 people were killed when an American Airlines flight collided with a U.S. military helicopter near Arlington, Virginia. The military has faced scrutiny as the helicopter was flying without its transponder running, which likely contributed to the crash. There were no survivors from either aircraft. On January 31st, an air ambulance crashed in a suburb of Philadelphia, killing all 6 occupants and 2 people on the ground. The cause of the crash has not yet been determined. In February, there were dramatic scenes at Toronto Pearson International Airport after a Delta Airlines flight overturned upon landing. All passengers and crew survived, but 21 people were injured in the incident. In April, a sightseeing helicopter crashed into the Hudson River in New York City, killing all 5 passengers and 1 pilot. It is reported that the tail boom of the aircraft failed, leading to the crash. Air India Flight 171 en route from India to London Gatwick crashed just 32 seconds after takeoff on June 12th. The plane landed on top of the dormitories of a local medical school, which further added to the casualties. 260 people were killed in the crash, with 1 survivor on the plane miraculously walking away. In July, a Bangladeshi military plane crashed into a school campus in a suburb of Dhaka. The crash left 36 people dead and 172 injured. On November 4th, 14 people were killed after a UPS cargo plane crashed in Louisville, Kentucky. It is reported that the left engine of the plane detached, leading to the crash. The cause for the engine failure has not yet been determined. In the early hours of March 17th, a fire broke out at Club Pulse, a nightclub in North Macedonia, killing some 59 attendees and injuring 150 others. In April, 221 people were left dead after the roof of a nightclub collapsed in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. While the cause of the collapse is officially under investigation, it is widely believed that the roof was overloaded. 25 people were killed in India's Goa state after a fire at a popular nightclub there was sparked just after midnight on December 7th. The cause of that fire was reported to be a defective gas cylinder. Also in India, 18 people were killed at a stampede in a railway station in February. The stampede occurred at a railway station near the capital, New Delhi, as thousands of Hindu pilgrims were trying to board a train bound for a religious festival. In Hong Kong, a fire at an apartment building killed at least 160 people and took 43 hours to fully extinguish. More than 1,000 people have also been left homeless as a result of the blaze. 16 people were killed and 23 injured when a funicular derailed in Lisbon, Portugal. The accident, which was caused by a cable failure, is the most deadly in Lisbon since the 1960s. An explosion at a weapons manufacturing plant in Tennessee killed 16 people in the early hours of October 10th. The explosion was ruled to be accidental in nature. It was a bloody start to the new year in the United States when an Islamic terrorist drove a truck into the crowded Bourbon Street in New Orleans. This happened on New Year's Day. The attacker killed 14 and injured 57. On the morning of August 27th, a gunman killed 2 and injured 30 at a Catholic school in Minneapolis. While the shooter didn't give an explicit reason for the attack, they were a former student of the school. 2 people were killed at Brown University after a gunman opened fire during final exams. The shooter escaped and was eventually found 5 days later, dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. 10 people were killed and 11 others injured at a school in Graz, Austria. The motivation for the attack is unconfirmed, but according to some reports, the shooter, who was a former student, was bullied at the school, which may have played a role in the attack. Canada was shocked after 12 people were left dead in the aftermath of a mass shooting at a pub in Toronto. 3 gunmen opened fire on the pub just after 10:30 p.m. before escaping in a vehicle. All were eventually apprehended by police. 160 people were injured in the British city of Liverpool after a 53-year-old driver plowed into a crowd of people attending a football parade. The driver's sole motivation appears to be anger at the traffic control measures. He was arrested and is serving a 21-year prison sentence. In Vancouver, an attack at a Filipino festival left 11 people dead and more than 30 injured. The mentally ill attacker drove a vehicle into the crowd just after 8 p.m. The BC government has been under heavy scrutiny as the attacker was known to the mental health system but had been released. Our modern world is increasingly reliant on the internet to function properly, and the modern internet is becoming increasingly centralized. The continued centralization of the internet means that an outage of a single provider can have massive repercussions all around the world. In 2025, we saw at least 3 such disruptions, with major incidents occurring at Microsoft Azure, Amazon AWS, and Cloudflare. All of them resulted in disruption to the lives and routines of millions of people. While none of these outages were the result of malicious action, the economic impact was no less severe. In December, Australia became the first major country to ban social media use by children under the age of 16. Under the new rules, 7 major social media companies, including Meta, Twitter, and TikTok, must suspend the accounts of users they suspect to be underage. While the law is rooted in good intentions, the reality is that privacy and user data security will certainly be compromised. And now the door has been left open to potentially begin forcing all social media users to link their real identity and allow government agencies to track them online. Other jurisdictions and privacy rights groups are watching the Australian experiment closely. In 2023, OpenAI wowed the world when it released the first version of ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a large language model that you can interact with in a conversational way. It almost feels like talking to another human. The release of ChatGPT has sparked an arms race, with dozens of other companies launching competing AI models. The result has been something like the dot-com boom of the early 2000s, with billions of dollars of investment being poured into AI companies. These companies all, by the way, fail to make a profit. This leads to concern over an AI bubble that could send stock markets tumbling should it pop. Outside of the financial impact, there are very real-world concerns with the proliferation of AI products, not the least of which is the massive amount of resources being poured into dozens of new data centers. AI workloads require vastly more energy than traditional computing. It means they need an order of magnitude more electricity and cooling capacity than conventional data centers. As companies build competing data centers, electricity and water is being diverted away from communities and into these massive facilities. And in the age of climate change, where everyone is being urged to consume less, not more, it raises the very real question about what the long-term impact of this bubble will be. The AI hype is also leading to companies shoving LLMs into our everyday lives, whether consumers want it or not. From Microsoft's invasive Copilot to Mozilla's proposed AI browser to AI-powered kitchen appliances, it's being forced on people in often unexpected ways. Could lead to user backlash against the technology. One of the most popular uses for LLMs and AI is so-called vibe coding. This is when a user uses an AI product to entirely create a software application using only plain language prompts. The technology is incredibly cool, and it lowers the barrier of entry to software development, but it has the potential for very real consequences as well. As vibe coding becomes more standard, the pool of junior software developers is certain to shrink, which means that eventually the pool of senior software developers will also shrink. Something that has repercussions for both a future workforce and future management as they try to maintain the code base. And finally, while most of the focus has been placed on US-based companies, other nations have been developing their own AI models. One of the most predominant has been the Chinese company DeepSeek. DeepSeek's AI benchmarks the same as some of the top US firms, but it uses a fraction of the resource footprint. While this is good news for our natural resources, it is decidedly bad news for Nvidia's share price, which tumbled 18% after the product was released. Overall, LLMs remain an intriguing technology that, when used correctly, can improve productivity and efficiency. However, the way it's being currently implemented and the fears around overvaluation and natural resources it consumes are all of high concern. On May 8th, Robert Francis Prevost became the first American-born pope, taking the name Pope Leo. Leo was elected the pope after Pope Francis died on April 21st. Air traffic in the Caribbean was severely disrupted on January 17th after a SpaceX rocket exploded minutes after takeoff. The rocket exploded in the air and sent debris spewing over a wide area, diverting flights and causing concern on the ground. While SpaceX CEO Elon Musk tried to poke humor at the mishap, the reality is that the debris could have caused major damage or injury had they landed in populated areas. SpaceX has been instructed to conduct a full incident investigation by the FAA. And those are the stories that caught my attention in 2025. There is no doubt that the world is in rough shape right now, with conflict raging on every continent, the United States in the midst of a shocking moral decline, and AI data centers gobbling up our natural resources just so they can be leveraged to take jobs away from the next generation. With everything that is wrong in the world, it's difficult to stay positive, and yet, there are promising signs on the horizon. In the US, people are taking notice and beginning to stand up to a tyrannical president. In Gaza, a ceasefire, however troubled, has at least been negotiated, and governments around the world are finally starting to take notice of the societal damage that social media is causing, even if they might be going about combating it the wrong way. I will end then on a hopeful note. May 2026 be an improvement on 2025. After all, it shouldn't be too difficult. For iNet, this is Christopher, reporting.